Hello and welcome to a grand tour with my great-great-granddad. My name is Ed Hill, and if you're tuning in again, this is going to be episode 53. Thanks for doing that. It's great to get regular listeners. If you're tuning in for the first time, then this podcast is based on the journals written by my great-great-grandfather, William Mowbray Campbell Scott, written in the 1840s about his travels around the world, plying his trade as a steam engineer, firstly in Europe and then in Mexico. And so far, we've got to his place of work in Mexico, which is a city called Zacatecas, where he's working in the mint or coin making industry. He's basically been employed there to introduce steam power into the process of stamping coins and cutting coins, and particularly the silver dollar, which at that time was a very widespread, sort of almost universal currency, a bit like the way the American dollar is today. In those days, the Mexican silver dollar was almost considered a universal currency that could be traded anywhere around the world, and mainly because it was particularly pure silver, and also it was made in a particularly accurate way that it was pretty well dependable. Each coin was the same as the next and the next one after that, and that, there was basically a very much standardization. But William's been brought in to sort of mechanize that process, basically, so they can produce more of these coins. So for the last, say, about 10 episodes, we've been in Mexico. If you want to listen to the previous episodes, up to about, I think it's episode 39, 40, that's related to all William's time in Europe, where he works as basically a train engineer or a railway engineer in Italy, in basically one of the very, very earliest railways in Italy, the second oldest railway between Milan and Monza. And then basically he travels across, after returning to the UK, he travels across the Atlantic on a paddle steamer to get to Mexico, to be part of really what was a kind of trend at the time of many foreigners getting involved in the sort of mining industry in Mexico after it had won its independence from Spain. So just to say, while Mexico was fighting Spain, obviously the mines got neglected, and after it won its independence, it was very keen to sort of revive its silver mining industry, and produce coins, and basically get its trading back on a similar par as it had been before the Revolutionary Wars. So they're very keen to attract new companies from abroad to invest in the Mexican silver mining industry, and William is part of this cohort of engineers and miners and people like that, from the UK and other countries as well, Germany, Ireland, some from America as well, who were getting involved in the industry at that time. So I should say a little bit about how you can contact me if you want to. If you want to contact me directly, you can do that on social media ways. There's several ways. There's a Twitter account or X account, and that's Scott the Historic. And the address there is at 3G Grand Tour. So that's the number 3G Grand Tour. There's a Blue Sky account, which is, I always have to look this one up, it's at scotsgrandtour.bsky.social, and there's also a Facebook page, which is pretty easy to remember. That's just at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. So those are ways that you can listen to the episodes, and you can also, I post on there sort of one or two things, images mainly about what's been involved in the podcasts, and it's also a way you can direct message me if you want, or make a comment, or any interaction is all welcome. So please go ahead and do so. If you know more of the history than I do, then by all means, I'm always happy to be corrected on things. My research is just basically what I'm doing on my own. I'm not a professional historian, so any sort of new insights or anything that you can explain more clearly to me would be most welcome. So what I normally do at this point is I say a little bit about where we were in the last episode 52, and a little bit about what we can expect at the beginning of episode 53. Well, at the end of episode 52, William had been in the nearby town of Fresnillo, which is near Zacatecas, where he'd visited a mine there, and he'd spent some time with some other expats singing songs and stuff like that of the hearty old days of remembering their time back in Blighty, old England, whatever, very nostalgic tales and songs. He'd witnessed a rather gruesome public execution in the square of Zacatecas, and then he'd explained the patio process, which is a way of extracting silver from the raw ore. And this was a process that had been particularly well developed in Mexico, and it was actually a pretty efficient way of getting the silver out of the ore. It was about 80% could be extracted from the ore, because silver doesn't usually just appear on its own as a mineral. It usually has to be extracted out of the ore that's mined. And in a way, the development of the patio process was part of Mexico's success in continuing to get silver and export it around the world. So that's where we were with William at the end of the last episode. At the beginning of this episode, it's a little bit different, because it almost kicks off straight away with him talking to an ex-Spanish soldier. So this was in the days when Spain still ruled Mexico. And basically, he starts chatting to him about his experiences fighting in the north border or northern territories of Mexico, which at that time included what is now a lot of America, Arizona and New Mexico and places like that, and Texas. His experiences fighting the Apache people, who regularly would raid the border at that time. So it basically kicks off with this sort of tale that this old soldier is telling William. So it's actually very colourful and very interesting. So I do hope you enjoy it. During my visit here, I met an old gentleman who had evidently seen much service in his day. And because during our conversation the northern provinces happened to be mentioned, and also an incursion of Indians from their provinces into the state of Zacatecas had taken place a few weeks ago, I felt rather curious on the subject, and consequently I asked the question if he had ever been in those parts. "Oh, sí, muchas veces," was the reply. "I have often traversed Sonora, Chihuahua, and the regions bordering on the wild Indians." "Then you have been amongst the Apaches?" I exclaimed eagerly. "Oh, yes, I have seen them very often, but I never visited their country, because they are muy barbaros, very barbaric. They used to come down amongst us, but this was only very rarely, and then generally for the purpose of plunder." He then continued, "They are a fine race of men, but at the same time muy barbaros. I was at that time a soldier in the Spanish army, and have often followed in their tracks. But they are by no means a pleasant enemy to encounter, for they use their bows and arrows with surprising skill. Their horses, too, are inconceivably swift. They appear and disappear like lightning. They are bold and desperate in their forages, as I have good cause to remember. On one occasion, I had the command of 50 men in an incursion into their country. At nightfall, we bivouacked in some desert huts on the verge of a pine forest, with a vast savanna of high grass before us. We placed our horses and mules in the corral and retired to sleep with our serapes on. I had just fallen asleep when I was roused by a very peculiar faint moan which came swelling through the air. I started up, and on going out of the hut, found our sentries at their posts. Again, we heard the cry, which was now louder and appeared to issue from the corral. I approached closer. Nothing but our animals met my view. Once more the harsh cry sounded through the air, but it was not the noise either of the mules, nor the neighing of the horses. I initially ordered our sentries to beat the alarm, and my men were quickly assembled. "Can you tell me the meaning of those strange sounds?" I inquired. "No," he replied. But all continued anxiously listening till the noise was again repeated. An old Indian who acted as our guide now stepped forward and said, "The Indians are hovering near us. It is the cry of the mules when they smell the Indians." Much struck by what he said, I questioned him more closely on the subject. He told me in the same words that the mules scented the Indians at many leagues' distance, and always intimated their terror by their strange cries. He observed that the only way this could be accounted for was the fact that the Indians eat mules' flesh, and that there was probably some connection between their scent and the odour of the Indians. I thought it much more likely that they discerned the far-off tramp of the mounted Indians and their horses. At this point my friend continued, "I accordingly gave the necessary directions and placed scouts among the long grass in advance of the huts. About an hour passed away without any appearance of the enemy, when the sentries announced that they distinctly heard the tramp of the cavalry. They were all called, and we took our station in silence within the huts, whilst about 20 men were concealed among the pine trees to act as sharpshooters. In the meantime, we had cut down branches from the trees and fortified the entrance of the huts with palisades, as well as the shortness of time would permit. I briefly addressed the men, telling them they must expect no quarter, but must resolve to beat the Indians or die. We soon heard the enemy advancing in a circle, uttering wild shrieks and cries. They then rushed upon the huts, wheeling round and round. I had ordered my men to reserve their fire till they were close upon us, and had actually commenced hostilities, for the night being very clear, we could distinctly recognise the Indians at some distance. Several now alighted, and attempted to enter the corral by breaking down the palisades. At that instant I gave the order to fire, and many Indians staggered and fell, whilst in the act of rushing upon us, with yells and shouts. Another volley from our musketry for an instant checked their advance, while the sharpshooters concealed in the woods fired in amongst them, and made great havoc by their unexpected assault. After a desperate conflict, they retired, carrying off with them the bodies of their dead and wounded comrades, and as they retreated, they discharged clouds of arrows amongst us. We, however, lost but 3 men, though many were severely wounded. Had they had firearms, they would have quickly driven us from our post, for they fought with desperate courage." As the old soldier spoke, his countenance lighted up for a moment with the fire of war, and then gradually sunk back into his wonted, as usual, his wonted quiet expression. Okay, I'm going to stop now at this point where this old Spanish soldier is telling the tale of his encounter with the Apache Indians. It's absolutely vivid story, and I do remember it very well from the first time that I read the journals, because also it was this thing that struck me at that time. This is a whole many generations really before the idea of cowboys and Indians has been created in, I don't know, Hollywood or in American folklore or whatever you want to call it. So to hear this account of the Mexican people dealing with the Apaches and how it affected them really struck me very vividly. I just really like William's enthusiasm of listening to this tale as well. Obviously, it's an exciting story for him to hear from this old soldier. And I had to say, doing a bit of research into it, has opened up a lot of stuff that I didn't really know about, didn't really realise. I'd tended to think that the, if you like, for want of a better word, Native American Indians struggle was mainly with the Western, or if you like, American settlers in America. But actually, there was actually a long history of them having disputes and battles and fights with the Spanish to the southern part of what we call the United States now, but at that time was still very much part of Mexico. And it actually dates back right to the 1500s, when the first sort of encounters and first disputes and first battles started happening with the Spanish. And the Comanche and Apache Indians, I think would be fair to say, those two main groups. And it could well be that this tale, that this gentleman's telling, it might have been a Comanche Indians rather than Apache Indians, although probably most likely Apache, given the state of the situation at the time. I just love all this stuff about, they're very, very fine warriors who are extremely good with their bows and arrows and stuff like this. It's stuff that's so kind of reminiscent for us, having watched many Hollywood movies of cowboys and Indians and so forth. It's kind of almost ingrained in our memory, or cultural memory. But of course, William's hearing it for the first time, and so it's almost a time before that, if you like, myth was created of the American battles against the indigenous peoples. I say myth, but for want of a better word, those folk tales and culture that's now being generated out of it. At the particular time this gentleman's talking about, round about from about the 1830s then onwards, actually things did deteriorate quite a lot between the Apache peoples and that northern part of Mexico and the residents and peoples there, because actually the Spanish had come under sort of agreement with the Apaches that they would live very much like you hear about the reservations that still exist today in America. There was these areas or regions, or parks, I suppose you'd call them. I'm probably going to say this wrong, but it's establishmentos de paz, establishments of peace. Basically, they were parks where the Apache Indians could live, and for the price of not continuing to raid the Mexican areas and Mexican people, they would be, to some extent, could be given food, and it was a way of the Spanish trying to sort of assimilate, if you like, the Apaches into Mexico, but it didn't really work. And particularly by around about the 1820s onwards, it deteriorated a lot, because after Spanish, or should I say Mexican independence, after it had its war with Spain, it really didn't have the resources to properly defend the northern territories that it had, and so the Apache, and that it couldn't really have the funds to support these parks either, these parks, peace parks, or as I say, you'd call them a reservation now. They are a forerunner to the reservations that are found in America. And so it was basically quite common that these raids took place, and unusual, and they grew and grew more after 1821 into the 1830s and beyond. It's all part of what is sort of described as the Apache-Mexican War, but by this later part, by about the time William's there, they were really quite common. And of course, then things sort of overtake the whole situation with the beginning of the American-Mexican War as well. But by about 1850, they kind of describe these northern parts, like Chihuahua was one. I think the other area that was badly affected was Sonora was badly affected, and Coahuila. I'm not sure I'm saying. Anyway, those were the three regions that were hit worse by the Apache raids. And in fact, they then, because they didn't really have the soldiers available anymore to fight them, and the military camps had all sort of deteriorated as well, they actually began to employ what they call scalp hunters to basically, these were kind of mercenaries. Some of them did come from the United States down into Mexico to basically hunt down Apaches, and rather unpleasantly, they'd get a certain amount of money for each scalp that they got. Although I think there's some dispute about how sort of successful these sort of Apache hunting or scalp hunters were, but basically they be paid a fee for every Apache that they killed. So yeah, it's just a really vivid story, and as I say, one that I remembered from the first time that I read the journals, because as I've said at the beginning, it's just that whole idea and of how that culture was there a long time before, if like in our modern culture we think of it. And this actually later on in this episode you'll sort of see, because this whole evolution of this Mexican culture and Spanish culture and horse riding and everything else very much actually is the real basis of what the cowboy was, or what the cowboy, the United States cowboy became. It really evolved out of the Spanish culture, really, rather than its own, I suppose you could say. It's a good job this gentleman had his sharpshooters in the forest to pick off the poor Indians, who, by the looks of it, at this time only had bows and arrows. As he said, if they'd had muskets or rifles, then I think the outcome would have been much, much worse for them. July 30th. The lasso. I had the opportunity of seeing the lasso used today. A large quantity of half-wild cattle was grazing at a short distance from the hacienda, when a horseman rode amongst them, and slinging out at a large ox, galloped after him, swung his lasso, and threw it over his horns, when by a sudden turn of the horse he compelled it to follow him. The lasso is made of horsehair, with a noose at one end through which the other end is passed, and this forms a sling. This sling must be thrown round the animal in such a manner that the other end does not escape out of the horseman's hand. The mounted Mexican never stirs without his lasso at his saddlebow, that's his saddlebag, and they use them upon all occasions in catching horses, mules, and cattle. They are as effective a part of a horseman's equipment as his cigar. Many Mexicans are so expert in the use of the lasso that it often becomes a dangerous weapon in their hands. They not only cast it over the neck of a horse at full gallop, but also frequently round one of the fore or hind legs, and accurately time the instant when to turn their horse so as to rein in or throw down the affrighted animal without themselves being thrown to the ground. Soldiers and robbers employ the lasso also against an invading enemy or an unsuspecting traveller. And on this very day I saw also an instance of this. Just as I was entering Zacatecas, I saw two persons mounted who appeared to be quarrelling. Suddenly one of them threw his lasso round the other, and striking his spurs into the animal he was riding, dragged his adversary to the ground, and trailed him along for a considerable distance, bruising the man very much. And then there's a subheading written in the journal here which says, Horses and Mules. The Mexican mules are smaller than the horses, and are particularly adapted for travelling. They rarely make a false step, on which account the traveller willingly resigns himself to their guidance in the abrupt and dangerous mountain passes of Mexico. If speed, however, be an object, the mules will not be urged beyond their usual trot, and you must therefore resort to horses. The Mexican horses are also smaller than the European, but in general stronger and more capable of enduring fatigue. It is well known that previous to the conquest, Mexico possessed neither mules, horses, nor cattle, all these having been introduced by the Spaniards. They are now extremely numerous, and on the northern plains of Mexico they are to be met with large herds, living in an almost wild state. Many thousands of these mules and horses are caught every year and sent for sale to Mexico and to the mines. By purchasing a large number of these horses before they are broken, you may get a horse in Zacatecas from $15 to $20 each, while the mules fetch from $30 to $50 each. In Mexico, the capital, the price is higher on account of the expense of transport. Yet even there you may buy a very fair horse which has been already ridden from 15 to £20. For a very fine horse, however, you must pay from £50 to £70, according to its qualities. But large and strong mules generally fetch a higher price than horses. The Mexican horses and mules are distinguished by their paces. So here he's talking about the way they step. Many of them have the sobrepaso, a species of pace wherein the animal lifts up and puts down his two right or left feet at the same time, but raising the forefoot more than the hinder, which produces a quicker and yet gentler motion than trotting. If the horse is to be used for the saddle, its price is determined by the rapidity of the smoothness of its pace. The animal can acquire the paso only on tolerable smooth roads, but with it a horse can perform without much exertion a journey of 15 or 20 leagues per diem. The horse now in my possession has travelled from 20 to 25 leagues per diem for 8 successive days, and finished the journey in full better condition than he commenced it. The Mexican horses are fed much below the English, both at home and on journeys, and yet with the superior training of the latter they are decidedly inferior as regards to endurance and fatigue. So it's a little bit confusing there. I think it's basically saying that despite being fed better, the English horses aren't as strong as the Mexican ones. The Mexican horse has scarcely reached the end of his day's journey when the saddle and bridle are removed without any regard to it being in a heat. Obviously horses exert and they sweat, but obviously Mexican horses don't sweat. They're acclimatised, I suppose, to the environment they're in. The horse is then turned into an open court without any covering being thrown over it, and frequently left exposed without food to the scorching sun or pouring rain. It is then taken to drink, and has a large ration of maize leaves or straw given to it, sufficient for its evening and morning feed. It is very seldom that a Mexican takes the trouble of dividing the food and giving half in the evening and the rest the following morning. The beast is saddled in the morning without any more drink till 9 or 10 o'clock, nor does it have any more food until the close of the day's journey. Poor old Mexican horses get a rough old time, don't they, poor old nags? Right, I'm going to stop here again at this point just to talk about these sort of two elements that William had written about in the journals, and actually they come under separate headings in his writing. So he begins each description as the lasso, and then it's underscored, and then horses and mules underscored as well. Just about the lasso really, because I just thought, well, he gives this vivid description of it being used. Also, I kind of like this incident that he sees where some poor chap gets lassoed himself and then dragged off his horse and dragged along the ground for a fair old way. The lasso kind of thing as we know it in sort of the cowboy culture or in sort of Mexican horse culture is very much a evolution or development in Mexico at that time. So obviously it begins with Spanish origins, but in its sort of modern context, as we would call it, well, I say modern, I mean in William's time we're talking about the 1840s, but as we also know it today, it does very much originate from the Mexican sort of horse riding tradition and cowboy tradition, or vaquero is the basically is the Mexican name for cowboy, which is and was the precursor really to the cowboy that we know in American culture. But I was sort of interested in learning a little bit more about the lasso. Now, the concept of lassoing does actually go back to ancient times. In fact, there's even hieroglyphs of Egyptians sort of using a lasso to capture cattle and horses and things like that. So, also it's used to this day in sort of Mongolia, and also by the Sami people in Finland and the north who herd their reindeer. You know, this idea of using ropes isn't sort of in itself a particularly Mexican or South American thing, but this tradition that's evolved in Mexico as we know it do now, and particularly as done on horseback, I think you could probably say is much more of a Mexican evolution of it. And there's also some sort of cultural thing that is suggested as well, that it developed out of a thing because before they used the lasso to capture cattle and things like that. They used a kind of hook thing on a long stick, which was really not very pleasant, because actually it had a sharp sort of edge to it, so it actually cut the sort of the hamstring, if you like, of the animal, so it brought it to the ground, and then they would kill it basically. So obviously there was no chance of the animal recovering in that way, and it can if it's lassoed. But that was a thing that was used in early New Spain, as would have been then in South America, but there's a suggestion that this was sort of outlawed, and so particularly for sort of the indigenous or kind of mixed race people that were evolving, if this at the time of the Spanish sort of incursion into South America, and that they were outlawed from using this tool. And so a way of getting around that was developing the lasso to control animals. That's, I think, just a sort of theory, but interesting if it was sort of true. I think what's kind of interesting is that, again, it's all part of this thing, as very much, I think, we know in, perhaps, I suppose it's because of our, you could say, Anglo-Saxon sort of connection with America. We tend to think of these things as being very American, and the cowboy thing being very American, and the tools of the trade of the cowboy being a very American thing. But they really all do have their origins in Mexico, really, and Southern America. And but what I do like is this description that he gives of the poor guy being a quarrel between these two Mexicans, and one of them basically lassos the other one and drags him off his horse and drags him along the ground, injuring him very much, or bruising him very much, I think is the rather understated way that William puts it. The lasso, actually, funny enough, in other cultures was kind of used more as a weapon rather than a sort of cattle thing, apparently, as a way of grabbing your enemy off their horse and then pulling them to the ground. But actually that wasn't primarily the case of how it was used in Mexico, but of course there were accounts of it happening, and William's account is a very sort of vivid one of such a case. And of course, the thing they say is, of course, it was sort of humiliating to be dragged off your horse. And, of course, being dragged along would have really actually caused a lot of injury. So, as I say, William's rather understated way of saying it. Probably the poor guy was probably half dead by the time this other chap had finished with him. There's also an element, I think, at this time as well, the vaquero, or cowboys, who would have been around Zacatecas at this time, they were quite a rough bunch, and I think they were certainly tough guys, really, and I think there's some sort of element of other people writing about them not really being very welcome around some places like Zacatecas, because they were sort of ruffians and caused a lot of trouble. But there we are. That's where I don't know, as I say, the tradition of the rough and tough cowboy might have come from. I then wanted to move on to this description of horses and mules that William gives, and it gives a very detailed account of how they were paid for and how they were valued, and what made a good horse and what made a good mule. I think what comes over quite clearly is, in many ways, mules were actually much more useful animals than horses in Mexico, because of their natural sort of toughness, their ability to be sure-footed on these very sort of mountainous terrain that was often the routes that they had to take to travel through central Mexico, particularly when they were carrying heavy loads like silver and stuff that was coming from the mines. So you can see why, when William's given the account of prices, that mules were actually, cost more than horses did. But the other thing that I looked into a little bit was this description of William's horse, because he describes it as having this sobro paso way of walking, or its gait. And apparently this was quite common in the horses in Mexico, that they they had this way of riding where I think Williams guys both legs go up at the same time, and anyway, it gave it a much smoother ride, and rather than a trot, and it meant that when you were travelling long distances, it was much more comfortable for the rider if the horses had this. It's often called an ambling gait, where they just basically give the rider a smoother ride than a trot. And in fact, in places like Peru, they actually bred specific, almost breeds of horse. I think there's one called the Peruvian Paso, which was a specific breed of horse. I think it still exists to this day, which always walks with this particular very smooth gait. I think in the case of the Peruvian one, it's even smoother, an even smoother ride than the one that William's describing. It's quite interesting, really, the change that William is having to do in his sort of transport every day. Very much in Europe, he was often in carriages or trains, obviously, wheeled ways of getting around. But here, the horse really takes quite a lot of importance to him, because it's something that he ends up having to ride every day, basically. So you could say in many ways, William does become a bit of a vaquero too. Whilst I'm on the subject of horses and mules, it will not be amiss if I take some notice of their riders in this place, especially as their costume is so different to anything seen in England. All the cities and large towns of this country possess either an Alameda or Paseo, it's a promenade basically, where the inhabitants are in the habit of congregating in the evening, but more especially on Sundays and holidays. Towards 5 in the afternoon, everyone hastens to these promenades, some in carriages, others on foot, but the majority on horseback. A horse intended for the promenade must be well fed, but not too large, and have a long thick mane, but its chief recommendation is raising the forefeet very high with an inclination outwards. On account of this motion, it is called a braseador. Only a single rein is used, generally of white leather, thickly studded with silver, with a sharp Arabian bit. The bit used here is indeed a very formidable article, and I have not the slightest doubt that I could break the jaw of a horse with it. A bit cruel, isn't it? Anyway, along the upper part of the frontlet, so that's the harness round the horse's forehead. Along the upper part of the frontlet runs a slip of 4 inches wide, embroidered at both ends with silver. It is made to draw down so as to cover the left eye of the horse in mounting. The saddle is similar to the Hungarian one, circular behind and terminating in a high pommel in the front, every part being thickly mounted with silver. The saddle is covered with a thickly embroidered fur covering, the armas de agua, so that's a rain protector. These are suspended from the pommel, and to complete this ridiculous accoutrement, the back part of the horse is invested with a leather coat of mail, called an ancuera, which reaches down the shanks. The ancuera is also embroidered and bordered with a fringe of brass or iron, which produces a loud jingling at every step. The original design of the ancuera was probably to defend the horse from arrows. Its present object is to prevent the animal from beating about its tail, and compels it to raise its forefeet by pressing upon the hinder parts. The armas de agua are 2 dressed calf, bear or tiger skins, the fur turned outwards, and are fastened to each side of the pommel, and as their name implies, they are drawn over the legs during rain, so as to completely cover the lower part of the rider. The armas de agua are considered a very ornamental part of the Mexican saddle, the top being bordered with red and yellow morocco, and frequently embroidered with silver. At any rate, I myself can bear testimony as to their usefulness, having frequently been out of hours in the heavy rain without getting in the least wetted. The costume of the rider is as grotesque as that of his horse, and of the most indescribable cut and shape, and accompanied by sundry strange appendages. And first, as to the trousers. They are very wide, and generally left open down nearly the whole of the leg and thigh, and they are ornamented with a vast number of buttons, which are more for show than use. These are generally of silver, and either of a bullet shape, or formed of small silver coins. These trousers are generally richly embroidered, and frequently cost from $40 to $50. Below the knee he wears a stag skin to protect his leg against thorns. Yet this nether equipment is on the whole highly ornamental, and sometimes cost from $60 to $70. The hat is of all colours, white, yellow, red, brown and black, with all the intermediate shades, and is generally very broad on the brim. Both brim and crown are sometimes trimmed with gold lace. The underside of the brim, which is green, is further decorated with gold lace about 2 inches wide. Some wear a gold or silver cord about the thickness of a finger 4 or 5 times round the hat, and with large tassels at the end. Others again have them covered with different coloured beads or velvet, and from 1 inch to 2 inches in diameter, and these are formed of 4 pieces tied together at the ends. They bear the exact resemblance to a string of sausages. To prevent these from falling off the hat, they wear a sort of projecting horn on each side, which gives the whole a most ridiculous appearance. The effect of this costume is heightened by the cloak, the manga or frazada. The manga is a piece of woolen cloth 5 or 6 yards in length, generally of a light blue colour, rounded at the corners, and has a hole out in the centre to admit the head. It is often lined with red or yellow calico and bordered with sundry trimmings of ribbons and fringe interwoven with glass beads. This trimming is generally of black silk and very frequently of gold tissue. The manga is furnished in this style. The laced hat, the richly embroidered trousers and boaters sometimes cost as much as $350, yet you often see them worn by persons who have expended their whole fortune on the purchase. A fortune perhaps just acquired at the gaming table, while others, such as mutineers, etc., gladly deny themselves many positive necessaries to become the happy owners of a manga. The frazada or serape, so this is a blanket we've spoken of before, is a large woolen covering displaying a gay pattern and is furnished, like the manga, with a hole for the head. It is principally worn on horseback and is almost impervious to rain. Right, so I'm going to stop here just briefly to talk about this very detailed description that William gives of these Mexican riders of that era. I'm not going to go into too much actual detail, really, because he does that in the actual journals, really. But just to say that when he talks about these male riders, turning up to the Alameda places, to promenade, really, along these parks with their horses, the attire that they're wearing and that their horses are wearing is very much a kind of decorative version of the practical garments and appendages that the horses would have had attached to them, that were used, for practical reasons in basically being ranchers, essentially, of cattle and horses in Mexico. So William's observing the very much decorative versions of things like these armas de agua, which were basically, they were like a great big leather. They weren't chaps, but because they were actually attached to the horse or to the saddle of the horse, and they protect the legs from the rain by being in front of your legs while you sat on the horse. It kind of reminds me of, if anyone's familiar with the Honda C50 and C90 motorbikes or mopeds, on the front of them they have these sort of weather guards. So in a way it was like the horse version of what you have on a C90 moped to protect your legs against the weather. And where they differ from chaps is obviously chaps were actually worn by the riders themselves, and as time went by these chaps actually became the preferred version to wear, because actually they offered more protection and they were more useful against protecting the front legs against thorns and things as well in the rough bush that they were riding through. And again, it's the same with the manga thing that they were wearing. That's basically a very big cloak that hung, the rider's head stuck through and then hung all down their shoulders and then down onto the horse's flanks as well. Will, again, is seeing these very grandly attired riders wearing them in the promenade areas, obviously just showing off, basically. It was a status symbol. As very much as Will describes, the cost that it would entail to wear and own these very decorative versions of these essentially practical garments and practical things that the ranchers would use that had evolved in Spain to had evolved in Mexico to sort of show off, really. So it's quite interesting to see Williams in an era before chaps became more widespread amongst them, more popular amongst the riders and the vaquero, as I've said before in the earlier section, which is essentially the Mexican word for cowboy, basically. Will also mentions this thing, the anquera, which is basically also a protective thing that hung over the rear of the horse to protect them. And as Will says, probably in early days may have been there to protect the horse against things like arrows and stuff, but obviously had a practical use as well when it came to riding and being a rancher, basically a rancher in New Mexico. So at this point, Williams sort of described the male attire, and then as you'll hear, he then goes on to describe what the female riders and ladies on the promenade would be wearing. And now, having described the gentlemen, it is only fair that I should say something about the ladies. In the city of Mexico itself, the dresses worn by the ladies are similar to those in Europe, with the exception of bonnets, these being an article that is rarely seen, the ladies placing their mantilla or shawls over their head to protect them from the sun, or cool in the winter. In the provinces, however, it is quite different, the dresses of the females being perfectly national. To begin then with the chemise, the most delicate part of the lady's dress, an article that the male part of the population seldom see in Europe, but as the Mexican ladies make no scruple in showing them, there is less difficulty in me describing them. These parts of their equipment are made high in the bosom and are drawn to the shape of the figure. They wear no corsets, but at the same time they wear half a dozen petticoats, and those generally of different colours, red, blue and yellow being the favourites. Talk of bustles indeed, the Mexican ladies have the appearance of a haystack with a female bust on the top of it. The upper part of the person and head is covered with the mantilla, which is a long scarf of silk or woolen, according to the wealth of the wearer. Very few of them wear stockings, and their feet is crammed into such small shoes that they appear when walking as if they trod upon hot iron. As to their general conduct, it is of the very worst description. They are lazy to the extreme, and will sit for hours at doors of their habitations smoking cigars. Added to this, they are licentious in the greatest degree, and have no shame nor moral feeling about them. Both sexes of the lower orders are the most inveterate thieves and cheats in existence. In fact, they think it an honour to possess themselves of the property of another, no matter by what means, and I have known repeated instances of men who have been detected in crime both at the mines, the reducing establishments, and the mint, and having been discharged for the offence, would come again the following morning and ask for employment as if nothing at all had been the matter. They are also sunk in the grossest ignorance and superstition, and the priests strive to keep them so. It is certainly a lamentable picture to look at this fine country, but such, however, is the fact. The spirit of gambling also pervades all classes of society. It is a passion to which everything is sacrificed. Bullfighting, cockfighting, cards and billiards. Indeed, we frequently see a person well dressed one day and the next running about nearly naked, everything being sacrificed to the gaming table. I remember an instance occurring during my late visit to Fresnillo that will illustrate the character of the people. There are certain kinds of gaming that is prohibited by the government, and the police, having suspicion that the forbidden game was being carried out at a certain house in the town, broke open the door and found a party at play. One of them was perfectly naked, having lost every article of his clothing. The police, however, caused them to be returned and dragged them all off to prison, where they could learn, I have no doubt, to be greater rogues than ever, if such a thing were possible. August 2nd. Tremendous tempest here this afternoon, accompanied by thunder and lightning, the latter extremely wild. A melancholy accident occurred at the Pan Clemente mine. The electric fluid struck a water carrier and his mule, both of whom were killed on the spot. August 4th. Sunday. Walked up the Pan Clemente mine this evening, and had also another violent tempest, but have not heard of any damage done. The rainy season has now set in earnest. Festival of San Domingo. The bells have been kicking up a most infernal clatter since 4 o'clock this morning. Vesper bell, 4 minutes before 7. August 11th, Sunday. Extremely lazy today. It has been one of the hottest I have yet felt since I have been in the country. A pleasant breeze, however, got up about 4 o'clock, and I then rode out for a couple of hours. Vesper bell, 5 minutes before 7. Okay, I'm going to stop again here where William's describing this element of what the ladies would have been wearing in Mexico at the time, and then he goes into this sort of kind of moral diatribe about how it represents their low morals. But it is, essentially a nice description of what the women would have been wearing at the time. I mean, of course, the thing is, these are all things that in Mexico is what people started to wear because they were fundamentally comfortable. Wearing corsets in a very hot and dusty country wasn't very great. So, I mean, this description of the women looking like haystacks with a head on top it's just because they didn't have corsets. But I'm sure, they looked actually very pretty in their own way. In fact, I think they sounded actually more interesting to look at than the kind of Victorian attire, which certainly in terms of respectable attire preferred sort of rather plain tones and not bright colours and was very regulated. And then things like the little shoes that they wore, which I must admit it did remind me of what you hear was fashionable at one time for women in China to wear, having their feet strapped, and I think they're actually called or referred to here as zapatos de China. So they were a kind of fashionable thing in Mexico at the time. So I don't think they went to the extremes of binding the feet, but obviously they making a reference to China style footwear as well. And then, as I say, then goes into this description of their moral character and the fact that they smoke cigars, which is obviously another sign of low morals. And then this attitude to petty theft and, thieving from work and then coming back the next day and asking for your job back, sort of thing. Of course, to William, this is all very culturally very different to him. And someone described it very nicely, actually. There's a tendency just from Victorian travellers to describe difference as deficiency, which I thought was a really good way of summing it up. William sort of sees these things as a kind of reflection on their moral character and moral behaviour. And there does seem to be this tendency of moral judgments being made by UK travellers of the time, coming from a Victorian background, a very, if you like, regimented sort of way, from a middle class perspective anyway, of what proper behaviour was and what proper attire was. Coming to a very fundamentally different place where attitudes were different. Obviously, Catholicism and its way of kind of treating things like gambling and managing it, really, rather than seeing it as an outright sin. These all look very huge cultural differences that William kind of does make judgments about. These days we are much more I'd say enlightened in our attitudes when we go to somewhere different, and we tend to think, oh, it's really great because they do this thing there, they do this cultural thing there that's so different from what we do when we travel. Certainly when, for example, my wife and I were traveling, we went somewhere in India and we saw the fantastically bright coloured saris that a lot of the women were wearing, particularly if you saw a group of them together in a public square somewhere. That vividness of the colours was fantastic. I don't think we'd have interpret it as a sign of low morals. In fact, it's something to be celebrated, but there does seem to be this tendency of as I say, I'll say that term again, treating difference as deficiency, that William has at the time. But I suppose you can't be too hard on him in a way. He's just coming from a very different world. And I mean, you do get it with people today as well. Quite often, I mean, in conversations with people, and they do just sort of go, oh yeah, you won't believe it, they do this, and you kind of go, well, yeah, it's a different country, it's a different place, what's wrong with that? But people kind of have an inherent sort of conservatism, and just because people do something different, that there's something wrong about it, and of course in William's case it's like taken to a real heightened degree. The other thing I just thought I'd like to mention here as a reference that he makes to basically this sad incident where a man gets struck by lightning, but he refers to it as the electric fluid, which of course at that time really they didn't still have a good understanding of what electricity was. So there was this sort of theory that electricity was a kind of invisible fluid like water or something, or oil, that somehow pervaded through nature and through the atmosphere, I suppose, when it was referring to lightning. But yeah, I just kind of like that term. It was quite a common term, so it's in a way not surprising William uses it as the electric fluid, but basically he's just talking about the man got struck by lightning and very, very sadly died. So which I think it's you always hear of these cases where people survive being hit by lightning, don't you, or struck by lightning. I'd like to know what the percentage of actual people who survive being struck by lightning and those who actually cop it by being. I bet it's sort of 80-20, but we end up thinking, oh, I might get away with it if I get struck by lightning. And I think it's probably it's very unlikely to do. It's a little bit actually like heart attacks. If you actually know the real figures of people who basically die of a heart attack first time and don't get revived and stuff like that, the percentage is actually much higher than you think. So we kind of almost, I don't know, in modern times we almost think heart attacks are regularly survivable, and the actual figures show that that's really not the case. But yeah, I do like the term electric fluid. maybe there should be some sort of band or something called that, I don't know. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the electric fluid. So that is the end of episode 53. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it or tuning into it. I think it's actually one of the most vivid episodes that I've read so far about William's time in Mexico. There's that particularly interesting tale that he recounts of talking to the gentleman about the Apache Indians at the beginning. And then obviously we had the thing about the lasso and the different types of horse and mule and all that. So very detailed actually stuff that William's writing here, and quite vivid descriptions. And then of course all encompassed in this usual sort of Victorian British view of the world and his kind of moral attitude to it. But as I say, I think there are really valuable things about it, because it's, again, as I've said right at the beginning of doing the podcasts about the journals, it's such a different world. It's so long ago that, there's kind of assumptions about things we make in culture and travelling and stuff like that there that are really alien to him. And to me, in a way, this epitomises it. This whole idea of talking about Apache Indians and also about how Mexican vaqueros, basically cowboys, existed, all in a time before as I say, particularly from, if you like, a white Anglo-Saxon British point of view, where we get a lot of our culture over, the last century, you could say, from America. Our view is very much sort of tinted by that and tainted by it, in the sense that we tend to view all these kind of cultural things developing in the United States of America, when really their origins go back a little bit further than that, and are much more sort of Spanish influenced and then Mexican influenced than we would sort of give credit for. So I do think that's, as I say, certainly from my perspective, and from someone who was reading the journals for the first time, really struck me that, this is in a time before, we're talking at a time, 60 years before, I think the first moving pictures were pretty well made. Let's say this about 1900. I know it's a little bit earlier than that, but let's say roughly 1900. I don't know when the first, if you like, what would be considered the first true Western was produced by a Hollywood movie maker. Probably W.D. Griffiths did one or something like that. So that would probably be considered one of the first cowboy movies. But, this is a whole, 60 years before then. So that is the end of this episode. I do hope you've enjoyed it. And from me, and if you can see in the background, Pengy, the cat, as well. If you've been enjoying, I'm not sure she's so fascinated by it as me, but she's been listening anyway. So anyway, as I say, that's the end of episode 53. So if you have been, thanks for listening.